when we think about the offer stage and reference checks, Katrina, this is the point where we're like, it feels like something needs to be reimagined, and that these two are in particular challenging aspects of the process to do that. And we've talked in the past about, like, there's just a way to make an offer in sort of Western management way. Like, if you're making an offer for anything, there's just sort of the way you do it. And to try and reimagine it where you're balancing power, you're shifting power dynamics, and in a way that still sort of gets you through the offer stage. With the reference checks, on the other hand, we have explored them in different ways. And so feel like there's been a bit more exploration and experimentation there, but still kind of like, maybe one or two questions, or maybe our approach to them is different, but sort of grounded in this sort of, or it keeps, I guess you referred to the snapback as like, it keeps sort of pulling you back to like just the way you do them. So, I mean, how are you thinking about them right now?
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about the reference checks very specifically, I mean, this has traditionally been a space where it's been a step for the organization to sort of protect itself from the unknown that these candidates might be bringing in, right? And so a big part of references has traditionally been this like verification, and always sort of on that sort of back foot. We want to make sure that what we've heard throughout the interviews is real. And so we're asking a third party or other people about, similar questions or about these candidates, just to try to find that common thread, or to have those messages that the candidate gives amplified by, those references. And also, right, we keep in mind that they've given us these references. And so they're doing a certain amount of curation on this as well. They may have some other conversations. And so, all of the ways that we disguise the reference check process, like we have to think about all of these things. And so, what you and I have been holding is, what are ways that we can continue to learn about the candidates and their maybe like self-awareness, or the ways that they're sort of wrestling and showing up in the workplace, and whether, what they're saying is consistent with what others have experienced, or the ways that others would talk about it. And so that, I think, has been a really interesting experiment. If you get the candidate to answer some questions and then have their reference answer, those same questions, and just see where those spaces line up. I think that's been one of the places that's been the most interesting as we've been exploring those references.
Yeah, when you were mentioning that is, I'm reminded of the concept of negligent hiring, and how reference checks are one of those places where you're supposed to find out some things that might actually, if you don't find them out, could end up with claims of negligent hiring. You hired someone who brought these things into the workplace, or whatever it might be, and now you're on the hook for it because you didn't find that out. And in reality, it's like, first, as you mentioned, their references are usually curated by the person, who hopefully has picked people who will say good things about them. Two, even if you're sort of listening for, like, so often you have to read between the lines of what a reference is saying. And so, like, you don't know someone, maybe you have 15, 20 minutes with them, and then a year later, you're like, oh, that's what that person meant when they said that thing. And so really reframing the references as just learning more about the person. Like, you get to the end of the process, typically move 2, maybe 3 people into the reference round. You're like, we could hire any one of these people, and we just want to get a little bit more nuance from people who actually know them and have worked with them. And so how might I work better with this person? Or, like, what does this person need to be to thrive in a workplace? So I can start to prepare for if this person becomes a member of a team, and not, find out a lot of things that they haven't told, like the candidate hasn't told us, that somehow will, like, totally change our mind one way or another about whether this is the right person for the role.
And we've addressed this before in that conversation about context. And so when we were doing question scenario building and things like that, and so when you're asking questions of references, you're getting a peek into a very specific context that that person would know very well, but you're still left guessing and trying to find that. I think that's what your space around
Yeah.
reading between the lines is really
Yeah.
like. Just because they say this, it doesn't mean it looks like that in your organization or in their new opportunity. And so really kind of looking at, from the position of going forward, what can I learn about this person, or how do we set ourselves up, or even like thinking developmentally about somebody's career, right? Like if we go into a new employee situation thinking that they're perfect and there's nowhere that we have to that they'll have it for areas of development or anything like that, you're sort of setting them up for this huge risk of being unsuccessful because you're not looking at some of that other stuff. And so talking to the references about, some of those developmental spaces, talking to the candidate about what they think their developmental spaces are, can help you in that onboarding stage, can help you in framing, who they need to talk to in the organization and how you can set them up for success once they get there. So it's that spirit of curiosity, more than maybe, rather than that spirit of being really hyper aware of fact finding or fault finding with that candidate's message in those interviews.
One of the things I think about with references and in particular recommendations for candidates is, unless you've worked in the organization right now, you don't know what it's like to work in the organization right now. And so, when people are like recommending, like, this would be a great person, and you're like, well, maybe, but like, it's like, there's a lot of variables at play. There's team dynamics that might have changed, even if this recommender worked at the organization previously. Like, teams have changed and different dynamics have changed in the organization. And sort of like listing for references to like, how might this person be successful? What do they need to be successful in this current iteration of the organization is really some of the stuff when I'm chatting with references, I'm trying to figure out. And I think going back to like your rubric, it's like you're comparing a candidate against the role, not against each other. And so when talking to references, thinking about, okay, if I were to work with this person, how would I work with them? How would we need to work with them? Okay. And then so candidate A to candidate B. All right. So if I would work with this person, what might that look like, to get more of a fuller picture of the candidate in this role, and not, well, against this other person or against other things. And so I think that has helped me, knowing that there's stuff that I just don't get that they're saying, but like, what kind of data do I pull out of this, this interview, reference check interview, to then inform the onboarding process that will be, bespoke to that individual a lot of times, based off of what we learned through the interviews and in the reference checks. So I guess a couple of things that, before we get to some of the questions that we ask, a couple of things that we do in advance, or that we don't do in advance. Mm-hmm. One of the things is not asking for references in advance. We talked about the different hurdles that people often insert into the process. Asking for references, you don't do that until like you actually get to the point where you might need them, because it's just another thing for people to do. Oftentimes people are afraid that you might contact them before they have a chance to notify the person. These are oftentimes, if we think about our own references, these are people that are busy people. We don't want to bother them unless absolutely necessary. They've given permission to be references. So like, taking any of that guesswork out of it, just like, don't ask until you're ready for it. And then when you ask, say, we won't contact them, like going into the third round, say, could you please send us 3 references with contact information and your relationship with this person? Were they a supervisor or someone on your team or a longtime colleague or a mentor? But being explicit about, and we won't contact this person until until we let you know, so that sometimes people want to give their candidates or their reference checks a heads up, or the references, a heads up, just to maintain that relationship that they have with them.
And I think there's another really big reason why we're not asking for those in advance, and that's because it takes time from the candidate themselves. And so if that is, I think you're saying, if that's a barrier to them being able to complete their application, or if they, it's that kind of ratio of energy and investment at the stage of the process that they're in. And so if you haven't even had a screening call with somebody and you're asking them for references, then they're doing all of this extra work that might not actually be needed. They're going out and testing, members of their network. They're having these conversations. And in some cases, that's a really like personal, private, and not necessarily a safe space to be letting your supervisor in that you're looking for another job, or kind of cluing in your network that things are shifting, that things might be shifting and moving for you. And so often that like premature ask has implications for the candidates that I think we should be really conscious and thinking about. And so when you get to that third round, that's when you're like, okay, the amount of like energy and investment from both sides in this says that a logical next step would be to provide references. That's like the best, that's where it should feel good, because the candidate knows that you're serious about them as a candidate. You know that you've prepped the candidate for that. They're going to get to choose the best possible people given the conversation that they've been having with you up until this point, and really prep those folks for that conversation as well.
And thinking about what oftentimes happens when you ask for references up front is it's another point where bias creeps into the system. Mm-hmm. Do I know these references? Oh, so-and-so, I'm a friend with them. I could ping them about this person. Or the quality of references. Oh, they gave 3 CEOs as their references. Well, it's like they might be family friends with those CEOs. They might not be good references. But it's like different ways, like, what college did they go to? Or like, did they work for a prestigious company beforehand? And so like, there's just ways that muddles the system that you're trying to create this unbiasing and this really structured process. So not asking for them means you don't even have to factor that into the equation until, as you're saying, Katrina, wait until the time you're ready. And then you'll often get better, more appropriate references when people know, oh, this is what they want to know. And these are the best people I have in my network to speak to that. Mm-hmm. As I mentioned, we typically recommend checking references for 1, 2, or 3, max 3 candidates, especially if you have a really solid pool coming into the third round, and then also letting the candidates know. We typically check references for more than one candidate, and coming into the third round is when we usually ask for the references, for that information, the contact information, usually email to set up a time to talk. Because much like when you're communicating with the candidate, you don't want to surprise references on the phone. You want people to be prepared and ready to have the conversation, mm-hmm. so they can pull together thoughts, especially if they're come in, hot from another meeting. It's going to help you get the best data from the conversation. So in the reference check conversations, right now, we typically ask 4 questions, and we set this up for 15, maybe 20-minute conversations, knowing that people are really busy. The first question that we ask references is, what advice could you give us so that we can be the best supervisor and colleague for them, allowing them to do their best work and thrive? This is usually where you get just sort of the dam breaks and like all of the information from the reference. This is where they usually go on and on and on about the candidate and everything, like just it's everything in the kitchen sink. So it just sort of opens things up. Mm-hmm. Maybe you want to ask a quick follow-up if you hear something in there, because you're going to get so much, you typically get so much out of it. But that's what we typically go with for the first question. The second question is, can you share an example or two of how this candidate challenged stereotypes and promoted sensitivity and inclusion in the workplace, or in the context that you know them? This is one of those questions that then ties back to those values around anti-racism, anti-oppression, equity, justice, inclusion. And it's an opportunity for us to hear from another person who knows this candidate, how they approach their work. And interestingly, sometimes we get more like information from this question with references than sometimes when we ask the candidate themselves. Mm-hmm. Someone who has seen how this person works in a space and works with teams usually provides better insight into how the person will do it. And not, it's maybe because someone's modest and they don't want to, like, they feel weird about offering how they approached it, their own work. And so having that secondary person saying, no, this is really what they did, and this is how it changed the team and changed the organization. I'll hold on the third question that we ask because it involves a bit of setup, but then we usually close with, is there anything else that you think we should know as we make our decision? And this is that opportunity for them to just offer anything in closing that might not have been included. And so starting with, thanks so much for taking time. Do you know about this position that this person's applying for? Or would you appreciate a quick sketch of the position, organization, sort of grounds them in the conversation, asking those three questions. And then the fourth question that we usually slot into the third spot is around the given that no one is perfect question. And this is usually, I think about when I've been called for references and people are like, given that no one's perfect, what should Katrina do to or be even better? And I'm like, well, she's great. And they're like, either I'm like sincerely blanking on something, or you don't want to say anything as a reference that could get Katrina disqualified from a job that she really wants and would probably be good at. So, several years ago, I found a twist on this question that I found really helpful. And you set it up in the third interview with the candidate. You let people know, you go through the references and say, all right, so thanks so much for sending the references. Are these still your current references? Is this the contact information? And is there anything we should know about the reference that's not included here? Like they're traveling out of the country for the next 3 weeks or something like that. That'll make it more challenging to schedule a call with them. And then it goes to, and when I talk to your references, one of the things I'll say, besides we think you're awesome and would love to have you in this role and work with you, is the given that no one's perfect question. And so you set it up as, given that no one's perfect, what are the two things that Katrina should do to be even awesome at what she does? The twist is, when I talk to, let's say, Jamie, I'm going to ask Jamie this question, and I'm going to tell him the two things that you say that Jamie would say about you. And I know it's a little convoluted about it, but it's essentially sort of that external verification or not. And so Katrina will say, here are the two things that Jamie says I should do to be an even better professional in my work and in my role. And then when you call Jamie, say, hey, Jamie, here are the two things that Katrina said. What do you think? Do they resonate with you? And it's just another way to have what usually turns in this odd exchange into a much deeper conversation. Because what often happens is people say, oh, I could totally see why they said that. But no, that actually isn't at all what they should do. I think they're really great at that. Or, yeah, that was an issue, but they got really good at, they really spent some time working on it. So it just sort of primes the pump for that part of the conversation. And it becomes like a conversation rather than that weird back and forth that you have together. So I'm going to pause because I know, Katrina, I threw out like that weird question is like, who am I getting two things from? But what are your reflections on the reference check questions at this point?
Well, I think, just even if we back up just a little bit to we recommend that 1, 2, or 3 reference, candidates we're going to check references for. I mean, just think about that as a multiplier, right? Like if you're talking to 2 or 3 people, for each of those people, and the same people in the spirit of consistency need to be making those phone calls and doing that work. I mean, you can start to see where that time starts to get longer and longer. And so we want to engage with people when we know we're serious about them. So this isn't about having all of the information for all of your third round candidates so that at some later point in time, you can put all of that on the table and make the best choice. This is about sort of learning as you go and identifying who those, key candidates are in that third round, so that this is a piece that sort of gets you up over the hill, maybe around considering that candidate and that opportunity, but doesn't actually give 3 days of work to the one person who needs to be doing those calls, and then, kind of unfairly kind of setting expectations for a bunch of candidates if you do that for more. So I think that was just one of the things that kind of came up kind of earlier for me. Another one is this, like, the idea of the sketch of how do we be a better leader or a better colleague to this person? What advice do you give us? And I really like that because, like you said, it kind of opens the floodgates, but it also gives you some indicators into the types of cultures and environments that they have been a part of before, right? Which I think is sort of really cool. I did a reference for a colleague a while back, and it played out exactly as you described, Tim. Like, they said, oh, how does this person thrive? And I started to describe the environment that I knew that they were a part of. And then we had this conversation where I was like, well, I don't know if that's actually the environment that you have. And so I ended up having some conversation with that person, I think, based on sort of my skill set, to say, like, wait a second, right? I'm answering this question, but is that even what you're looking for? Because the person I'm speaking about can fully adapt and has experiences working in all of these different kinds of environments. That was my preference. And so I think kind of sketching out that idea of, like, do you know anything about this role? Here's sort of how we're thinking about or framing this opportunity, really helps them to say, oh, right, yeah. And in what I know about this candidate in that kind of a context or those kinds of parameters, here's some of the things that I would offer. And that might shift just a little bit the information that you get from those references. I think the last thing that is sort of, front of mind for me as I hear you talk about that given nobody's perfect question, is that this is actually really fun. The candidates are always expecting to be sort of grilled a little bit, right, in their interviews. And so when you ask them about what would somebody else say, it sort of stumps them a little bit. Like, they're like, oh, I've been so focused on speaking from my own perspective that when I have to sort of sit in somebody else's seat and look at my own piece, like, the things that come up are often super thoughtful, and it can be really difficult for people to come up with. But if you can sit in that space with them and give them, those 2 beats to kind of figure out where they're going, you usually get some really rich insights. And then they end up being really curious about what the reference said, whether or not. So maybe they're having a conversation about it after the fact as well, which is, always good to continue those conversations. So I think that's, those are sort of the 3 things that, like, sometimes it's a hard question to answer. You need to kind of, as the person that's asking, just give that space for people, because it's not a frame they're maybe used to thinking about it, or one that you've asked them to use, in those interviews up until that moment.
Yeah, that's such a great point. That part of the reason this question can work is that you've built rapport and trust with the candidate over multiple rounds and interactions, because it is often 9 times out of 10, someone's going to, like, pause for a long time to think about what their references would say. And I have a former colleague who hates this question because it sometimes provides these really awkwardly long, seemingly long pauses of silence in the interview. And just be with that. Just let someone think through, because as someone who would sort of see that curveball and be like, I'm going to sit here, I'm thinking about it, just give me a second. Just be there, and also recognize, explicitly say, like, no, this is a little challenging. So they take your time. And then at the end of it, be sure to sort of thank you so much for doing that. We know this is a kind of weird question. It sort of shifts gears in a way that often isn't expected in interviews, but we really find it to be helpful to be able to have deeper conversations with your references than what typically occur. And I think people appreciate that, especially if they've, gotten to this point in the process, they've seen how you sort of structure the thoughtfulness that goes into it, the bespoke sort of building the plane while flying, that I think it really really resonates in a way that
Totally.
it continues that thoughtfulness, and it's not just reference checks as a thing to check the box and be done with it really quickly.
Tim, one thing before we sort of close out this conversation, I do want to mention is just that, what we've described as a reference process for sort of a general, search with a general sort of need for the reference. And this doesn't exclude if your position actually realistically requires some kind of security clearance or, record check of some kind, because that's actually kind of a really important key part of the qualifications or the KSAs that somebody needs to have there. And so, that this would maybe go with that, but wouldn't be a substitute for that if that's one of the things that the role that you're looking at really does need. There's probably lots of ways to like pause in those moments and see how that can look and feel different also. But just what we're talking about here is very specifically that like that more generalized kind of consistent part of a process that would be applicable to many roles. I think that sort of brings us to the end of our kind of little early blurb on the reference check process. But we'll be next recording our video about the offer stage. So stay tuned.